Okay, so today I got a video for you guys that many of you have been asking for, and it has to do with phaser noise on the 5.4 3 valve, of course. And unfortunately, I'm only doing phasers. I'm not pulling the front cover and doing timing and tensioners and all that garbage. But I am doing phasers on car, valve covers off. And I'm going to show you the noise here in a second. These aren't too bad. The only special tool you really need is, in all actuality, is the wedge tool for the timing chain. And there's other ways around that too, but I'll be using the wedge tool to hold the timing chain so it does not come loose from the bottom sprocket there on the crank. And once that's held in place, you mark it and you just swap it out, so it's not that bad. So I'm going to go out there and we're going to show you the noise. Hopefully you can hear it. I'll explain it before I go out there so you kind of know what it is. At the very front of the valve cover, by the front cover on the very top, there's two little ears on the valve covers, and that's where the camshaft phaser sits. And it's got a little locking pin in there that locks it at base idle, which is 10 degrees before top dead center, something like that. I don't think they deviated it from that at all. I think it's 10 degrees still. Anyways, it locks it in there, so there's no oil pressure. It'll at least have base idle and be able to start and all that from there. And then once you start going, the VCT solenoids let oil flow through. It lifts that pin off of there, and then the phaser's allowed to move within itself and adjust timing as you go down the road. Then, of course, you're not going to have the noise because the locking pin is null and void at that point. But at idle, and at hot idle, you're going to have that thin oil, and you're going to have a little bit lower oil pressure, especially at hot idle, and you're going to be able to hear it. And that's when you're most likely going to be able to notice it, especially like, let's say you're going through a drive-through or something like that, and you're idling next to a building, you're going to hear tuck, 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 tuck. And it's going to be like a low-frequency knocking noise. And you put your hand right there on top of the valve cover. You asked me hot, but you can actually feel it there too. So we're going to go and try to show you how it sounds, and where to look for it with either a stethoscope or a long flat blade screwdriver of sorts, and you can kind of put it to your ear and listen, pinpoint where it's at. But if you're hearing it anywhere near the front of the cover there, away from all the lifters and the roller rockers there, the only thing up there is the phaser. So you'll be able to pinpoint it pretty easy. And usually it's the right hand one for some reason. I think the oil goes from the left hand head back and around and then feeds the right hand head from back to front. And that's why you'll start to hear it more over there. So that's something to keep in mind if you're hearing it. Check the right hand side first. If you really can't locate it on the left side, you kind of hear it in this area. Go to the right side and you're probably going to hear it a lot more, and it's just resonating through the engine compartment, and it's actually coming from the right hand head valve cover area. Maybe you can hear it. Okay, so this phaser replacement video on the 5.4 liter 3 valve is going to be on an 11 Expedition. The air intake and stuff like that's a little different, but the actual base engine and procedure is exactly the same. So we can go ahead and follow this in generalization until we get down to the nitty-gritty, which is the timing and the changing the phasers out themselves. So we're going to pull the air box here. Air intake snorkel, get as much out of the way. Extra free. And then we're going to start pulling the harness that goes along right here. And then the same thing on all models. We're going to pull the harness that goes over the valve covers. We're going to pull the PCV breather line right here, the hose right here. And we're going to take all the ignition coils out. There's 8 of them obviously, and there's 7mm bolts on them. And they have one little connector on that's unclipped. So in the end, yours should look something like this. All the coils off, all the connections for this harness that goes over the valve cover, disconnected all the way down and around the bottom of the valve cover. There's a bunch of retainers and all that. And the last thing we got to do for the left-hand valve cover is pull the 8mm bolt that bolts the oil dipstick to the side of the head. And that'll swivel away, and we'll be able to start taking the bolts out for the valve cover. Before I do that, since we're all free and clear otherwise, I make sure I go all the way up in here and down in the spark plug wells and all around the well. It likes to get a lot of mud and stuff in there, and I have to dig around in there with the compressed air and try to get as much out of there as possible before we open up the engine, because that's like a fine gritty powder going right into the open engine. So I get most out I can. After that, there's a bunch of 8mm bolts like this one all the way around. The newer engines, maybe mid-year 07, they redesigned the valve covers, and they had about 4 less bolts on them. The valve cover is a little more rigid, so then you have to use as many bolts to secure it down evenly. So the newer ones are easier, and the older ones just have a couple more bolts, namely the one in the middle of the cover right here, but in the very back. And that one's probably the worst one to get to, but it's just a little 8mm bolt. And just take those out, and then we'll start lifting up on it. Now, I am going to be doing both sides, so I'm going to do the same thing with the harness and all the connections and coils on the right-hand bank and get that one cleaned off and ready at the same time as the left-hand side. We'll pull them both at the same time. And then once all your bolts are loose, I do a quick blow of the air hose again, just so that it cleans up any loose debris from unscrewing all those connections and everything. And right about here in the front is a good place to pry up on here. It shouldn't take much at all. You just need to break the seal from the heat cycles over the years. And then it should simply lift up and out of here. Because the gasket usually stays something like this. We just pull our gasket out of here. And then before anything gets disturbed, I go around and get up any residual dirt before it slides and falls down in there. Wipe the rim. And now that the valve covers are both off, we can start putting the crankshaft keyway at the 12 o'clock position, and I'll show you how to do that. And that will properly set our cams. So all we have to do is take out 3 roller lifters per side that you're working on, and that right there at that perfect position will actually relieve stress on the full length of the camshaft. And then before going any further, we need to put the crankshaft spoke at the 12 o'clock position. And yes, there's 3 of them, but one of them has a timing mark grooved into the pulley. And that'll be at the 1 o'clock position, while the spoke here will be at the 12 o'clock. Once you find that, put a mark on it, and then turn it clockwise, and get it to the 12 o'clock position like this. And then we're going to recheck our cam lobes to make sure we're at the right position. And that little timing mark that's grooved into the pulley is right here. You can see it right there. There's a little notch in it, and that should be at the 1 o'clock position, while the crank is at the 12. So for this one, we need to turn the crankshaft another 360 degrees. These cam lobes are not in the right position. The intakes for number 5, the base circle should be up here, and the tip of it right here should be facing down towards this side of the block here. Okay, so I'm going to crank the crank another 360 degrees, and our cam lobes for the intake should be facing down instead of pointing up at the camera right now on the 2 intakes there. And I'll be putting pictures also in the description down below that shows it in more detail than I ever could. This is why it's nice to have the mark on the crankshaft, so we can easily get it back to 12 o'clock with a good visual. And now the camshaft is actually pointing the correct way, the lobes on there. You can see they're both pointing down towards the outside of the head. And on this side, for aligning number 1 cylinder, these are correct also. These are pointing up a little bit, both these intakes, and they're pointing out. And then this is the exhaust. And now it's time to pull the 3 roller followers out of here, rocker arms, whatever you want to call them. And we got to pull this one out, the center one, for number 1 cylinder. And then back at number 4 cylinder, we need to pull the 2 intake ones out, which are the 2 outside ones. And you can see they're both pointing up, and they're at base circle. And you pull those out. And then if you're doing the left-hand bank, we're going to pull the 2 intakes on number 5. And then we go all the way to the back here. We're going to pull the exhaust on number 8. And this is the crazy contraption we have to pull off the roller followers. It's a really weird setup, but it works. So you're going to have to find something similar to pop those 3 off on each bank that you're working on. Okay, I'm going to show you a little trick to get these roller followers out of here if you don't have that fancy Ford tool to compress the valve spring and pull it out of there loose. What you can do is put a screwdriver right in here in this slot and pry off the cam lobes here very carefully with a rag to protect the cam lobes, and it'll compress the spring and it'll pop right out. So I'll show you how to do it. I don't prefer to do it this way because there is the risk of damage to the lobes, but they are ultra hard, and if you use a rag, it's most likely not going to happen. So just for reference, number 1, we're taking off the exhaust, which is the middle, and number 4, we are taking off both intakes, which are the outer ones. And then over here on number 5, right here on the left-hand bank, we're taking out both intakes, the outer ones. And then on number 8, we are pulling out the 1 exhaust roller follower there. And then just keep them in order, something like that, so they can go back into their original positions and wear patterns. Now before going any further, we need to loosen the bolt, the 15mm bolt right there that holds the actual phaser to the cam. And we're going to break torque on it now, about 1 full turn, and get it loosened up so when we go to our final positioning of the crankshaft in a second here, we don't disturb it. So we're going to do it now. So break torque on these, get them 1 full turn loose, and then pull your cam sensor out. It's an 8mm bolt right there, just slides right out, and that way it won't hit no tangs on here or get damaged going in or out with the new phasers. And after that's loosened and that sensor's out, we can start turning the crankshaft to the final positioning. Okay, so you can see we brought it back a little bit when we did the breaking of torque on the actual phaser bolts. So we're going to bring it back to the 12 o'clock position, and we know you got a base from there where it should have been, and then we're going to go to the 6 o'clock position with the white mark. Another compression stroke. Let's get it tight again. And you can see now we got the timing mark and the timing spoke as called out in the manual at the 6 o'clock position now, and our little actual timing mark at the 7 o'clock. And it just has to be close, doesn't have to be perfect. Nice and close, pointing down like this one. Alright, you get your little piece of timing wedge cheese here, and you snake it in there. Then get it down far enough you get over here, and the curved side goes to this side, and you'll see the curve of the timing chain. So you see the curve on there? And that simply goes down in there. And you give it a good wedge, push it in, and it'll be wedged in there real good. You can see it wedged down there between the two sides of the chain, and that'll hold the chain forward so it doesn't come off the crankshaft sprocket. Okay, so here's the most important part of the whole procedure, is marking the timing chain to the old phaser. And if at all possible, I mark it with the stamped in R or L. So, because those are static marks and those are going to be in the same spot, instead of, oh, well, it's easier up here, so I'll just mark it here to here and make a little scribe mark. I'd rather do it on the stamped part of the phaser, and you'll never mess it up that way. Once you got your timing marks marked on here and set, we can take this 15mm bolt all the way out, and then we pull the phaser right off of there, and the camshafts will not spin or anything. They're in a neutral position right now, and that was the whole point of taking those 3 out and then rotating it another 180 degrees. And now it's all neutral, and you can take these off as you please, and it won't rotate on you and mess up the timing. Okay, so don't worry, I'm going to do this right in front of you so you can see. Hopefully you got a good view there. We're going to pull the bolt out, and these bolts are not reusable, so your new phaser should be coming with new bolts in them. Just make sure your timing wedge is really in there, and don't try to bump it or anything like that while we're popping this phaser off. We don't want to disturb it and lose timing. Mine's in there pretty good, so it kind of wedges in there nice. Just bolt all the way out. This one actually has an oil feed through it with the holes, and it's one-time use only. Now after that, because our cam sensor is out of the way, we can simply slide it forward. And one thing I forgot to mention is when you're doing these timing marks, these paint marks, clean the chain and the phaser beforehand with some brake clean. Spray it on a rag, don't spray it down in there, and that'll make sure they don't wipe off when we're doing all this. And you can see how it falls down like that, and that's where you get your slack from. And then you just simply start pulling it off of there. And this is the other option. A lot of guys take it off there, they hold it and they keep it tight, and they put a bungee on here and pull it tight. whereas I'm using the the Ford method with the cheese. And then you just start working your new one on there. I got my R marked already on the new one just for ease. I can start lining that up and then laying it over the rest of it like so. And then we can start concentrating on getting that pin lined up in the camshaft, and you'll feel it just fall in all of a sudden. And then you can bust your bolt out and start screwing it in. And you should be able to thread it in like this all the way. Make it just snug up a bit. And we'll torque it down later. Look at the actual chain on here, make sure it's going down straight. You can see like that, it's going straight down. It's not veering off to the left or right, indicating we're not fully seated on here. And then you can also look back here and we can see we're evenly spaced all the way around from the back of the phaser to that groove. And we know we're on straight, plus the bolt went in all the way by hand. So we just got the bolt snugged down for now, and we're safe to pull the piece of cheese out of there now and go on to the other side if you're doing the other side before torquing this down. So if you are doing the other bank, do it now and get it locked in like that and snugged down, and we'll torque them both at the same time, the final torquing of the phaser bolt. Once your phaser bolts are snug, we're going to turn the crankshaft counterclockwise back to that 12 o'clock position on the white mark. And then at each bank you actually opened up, reinstall your roller followers. Okay, so again, if you don't have that special tool to put these in or take them out, you can place it on there over the valve stem and the lifter, and then use a curved pry bar like this, and you just pry against the head. Doesn't damage it. Doesn't take much. Just gotta be at the right angle, and it'll actually pop it on there for you. And that's doing it the same way as the actual tool. You're compressing the valve spring and then you're popping it over. And then once all your roller followers are in on each side that you took out, we needed to torque down the phaser bolt to 30 foot-pounds. And then we just need to turn it an additional 90 degrees. Just put a little paint mark on there. And you'll have a reference then. Almost there. And there it is. Make sure you do that on both sides if you took it off. And that is about it. Only few notes I have is make sure you put your cam sensor back in, obviously bolted up. See right here where the old sealant's at, and you scrape that off and put on new sealant, regular engine sealant on both sides here. You'll see it. And put the valve covers back on, coils back in, air intake back on, and then we can make sure the sealant dries for about a half an hour, and we can test it out. And that's all there is to changing the phasers on a 5.4 liter 3 valve. Follow my basic instructions and recheck your work as you go along, and it should come out like this, sounding like a brand new engine, and no rough idle, no check engine lights, and running perfectly smooth like this.